This time on Poll Hub, the title of an article in The Atlantic sums up our first segment pretty well. Everything is terrible, but I'm fine. Why does public opinion sometimes diverge so far from established facts? Well, Joe Biden seemed to base his State of the Union on that premise, so we're taking a look. Then, the Census Bureau is already planning for the 2030 count and is considering adding a bunch of new questions that could have the effect of making America look more multiracial and more multi-ethnic. In other words, making the count more accurate. NPR's Hansi Lo Wang joins us to explain the proposed changes and what they could mean for everybody, including pollsters. And we end with a critical question. Are you Team Valentine's Day or Team Super Bowl? Lee can't quite fathom my answer. Gotta stick around for that one. Let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffith.
And I am Lee Marigoff.
And we start today with a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart. And thanks, very special thanks this week to Athen and Eve on our student team who helped put this segment together. But it's always bothered me as a political reporter and then working here at the Poll when public opinion seems to diverge so far away from data or facts. And it's not a new thing, as we'll discover. But it is something that has really come to attention and prominence in the last few days as a couple of polls regarding politics in this country have sparked headlines along the lines of, why is everybody so down about this when everything's so good, in the data? And here's what we mean. A new poll from Washington Post, ABC News, that shows 39% of Americans believe that President Biden has accomplished little or nothing during his presidency. 36%. Similar numbers say he's done a great deal or a good amount. I mean, demonstrably, historians are going to say that the first 2 years of his term have been about as impactful as any first 2 years of any president's term. You might not like what he did, but there's kind of no discussion to have about whether a lot was accomplished. Another thing, 34% of Americans, only 30% in that poll, believe that Biden has created good jobs. But the economic data belies this. The unemployment rate was the lowest since 1969 last month at 3.5%. The GDP grew in the fourth quarter of 2022, which is the most recent stats we have, at 2.9%. And the latest median household income data shows that inflation-adjusted income is at the highest level in this century at $79,400. So how come Americans think the economy is bad? And how come they don't think Joe Biden has done anything? Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox. What is behind this? You, Lee, are a political science expert. Barb, you know more about public opinion than practically anybody. Why is there this dissonance between what people think and what the facts are about these things?
Well, I would just say that it's not necessarily new that this is occurring. I think it's gotten a lot worse now that people don't have similar sources of information, and we all sort of get our information through a very different mode of communication, and that's certainly new. So we now have the presence of alternative facts in our vocabulary and how we approach things. And then you have two sides of a country fairly evenly divided, with each side very, very, very much opposed to the perception and the viewpoint of the other side. So what's up for one is down for the other, and what's half full for one is half empty for the other. We're in a very different situation right now than when the entire population of the world thought the world was flat. And then it took a long time to get past that. And we've sort of learned, and almost we have uniformity now, that the world is in fact not flat. But we aren't getting that when it comes to
Are we really sure of that? I'm not sure. Are we really sure? But Barb, he points out this isn't new.
Yeah, it's not new, and also I think that's part of the story. I think that's one piece of it. Certainly, we do have different windows into what is going on, but I don't think we can discount personal experience. Things are not easy. I think last night we're recording this on Wednesday, the night after the State of the Union. And the president even mentioned, you don't necessarily know I've done these things because some of them haven't taken effect. And I think the same thing can be said for the economy. Yes, the numbers are getting better. Yes, the numbers are actually good. But I think it takes a while before that sinks in and that experience is had by the majority of people. We went through an incredibly inflationary period over the past year. And yes, inflation has slowed, and that's terrific, but stuff is still really expensive. Things have doubled. Food prices are still exorbitant. We can now get many items because the supply chains are moving more smoothly. But it still costs a lot of money. And although there have been improvements and gains made in wages, it really didn't keep up. I mean, those gains that many people saw over the summer last year were quickly eaten up by the exploding inflation on many items. And even though gasoline has stabilized, I would say stabilized. It hasn't come down all that much. So things are still very expensive. Jobs, yes, are pretty plentiful, but you don't necessarily match the skills with the jobs. And there are many people that don't have that match and live in areas that don't have that match. So I think there's still a lot to be accomplished. The president said as much, in other words, that we still have much more to do. And I think he was imploring this new Congress to perhaps to take the reins of the previous Congress that did find ways to compromise and move a lot of policy and programs forward.
I would push back on one thing you said, which is the people's perceptions. In the Federal Reserve polls people and asks them what their own well-being is, how they feel about their own financial well-being. From 2017 to today, that number, the people saying that their own financial well-being is at least okay, has increased from 74 to 78%. It's been a steady incline. I think there's an interesting way to look at this that an author in The Atlantic, Derek Thompson, wrote about last summer. The title of the article kind of sums up this segment. Everything's terrible, but I'm fine. And his point is that when you ask people how they're doing, they're like, yeah, I'm fine, but everything's terrible. Oh, the economy's terrible, but you're fine. That's the dissonance I'm getting at. And he relates that this has gone on for a long time. For instance, Richard Nixon, when he was president in 1969, the economy was perceived to be terrible, and the economy was actually pretty good at the same time that there was polling showing people perceiving to be the economy bad. George Bush, the first one, would certainly love to have had public opinion catch up with how good the economy was doing in 92 when Bill Clinton won, right? So again, this isn't new. But I think Thompson gets at something here, which is people feel like things are okay for them, but they don't think things are good for the economy in general. And that's, I guess, where I just don't entirely get it.
Yeah, people have a sense of optimism too about the future sometimes that belies what their present condition is. So there's different ways of slicing this, and I think that I was fascinated that Joe Biden in his State of the Union spent the first half at least talking about, folks, I've accomplished a whole bunch of stuff. And as Barb said, it's not just that you may not even know that we passed this stuff. And, we're moving. Things are getting better. And then he went with the laundry list of promises in the second half. Usually it's all promises.
Well, I also think that there is, a good deal of concern about a number of issues that, yes, financially, I'm okay, but there's a sense that the economy isn't okay. And yes, you can look at the numbers, but then you look at a lot of the messaging. You look at competitiveness. You look at education. You look at healthcare. You may have healthcare, but you don't necessarily think that healthcare is doing well in this country. You have a sense that there are a lot of inequities and imbalances, whether it's the care that you get or the care that you can afford. So I think when people are asked, particularly in survey questions, to give a general sense of how things are going, they're thinking broader and beyond perhaps their own pocketbooks at the time. But I still would say that people generally do feel like, although they may be keeping up right now, that it's not easy to do that.
So before we move on to the next segment, real quick, is this a fault of messaging, the people who accomplish something like the Biden administration? Is it a fault of the media for highlighting, you know, recession, recession? Is it the fault of the financial analysts? Because the media is just saying what all the financial analysts are saying, which is we're supposed to have been in a recession a year ago. We still aren't there. Whose fault is this?
Did you give me an all the above choice there?
Yeah, okay, sure. And all of the above would be D, all of the above. You go with all
Yeah.
of
I
the
think
above,
okay,
Barb?
but hang on a second. I mean, I think that there is some lapse in leadership. I think one of the takeaways that we can get from the Trump administration is that messaging does matter. And leadership in messaging really matters. And so that was, front and center for that administration to control the daily agenda. And that makes an enormous difference. There's no question about that. But I think also historically, uh, public opinion is a bit ahead of the recession analysts. We generally tend to believe that there is a recession sooner than the numbers will tell us, and public opinion also lags when economic times get better. Because it does take a while for us all to acknowledge and to experience that those numbers are part of our everyday life.
Yeah, and right now we're all on different pages. And I think we all believe to our core that if given the right information, accurate information, people will make the right decisions in our politics and our economics in their own lives. The trouble is right now we can't get on the same page as to what the correct information is because we're getting it from so many different sources, and it is difficult. I think it has become difficult. And I think the Biden administration last night tried to get with the program and try to get their message, at least close the messaging gap that you allude to.
And we'll see how that works.
The U.S. decennial census is back in the news, and most Americans probably won't be giving it much thought for another 7 years. But the Biden administration is proposing major changes to its forms and how we Americans describe our demography. And the plans are that they will have these in place for the 2030 census. What this all means and what changes we may expect. We are joined by Hansi Lo Wang, NPR correspondent, and as we like to say affectionately, our census expert, to help us decipher and figure out what we can expect. Thanks for joining us, Hansi.
Thank you for having me.
So, data equity. What is it exactly, and why is there so much partisan wrangling about it? And really, why do we need it?
Well, data equity, as the Biden administration has talked about it, it is really focused on how there are certain communities that do not see themselves reflected in the way that federal government forms, including the census form, asks about race and ethnicity. And this isn't just about capturing and asking about someone's identity in the data. It's also about how that data is then used. And in the absence of data or in the difficulty of finding certain communities within existing data, it makes it very hard to make informed policy decisions, to guide health research, to figure out a fair distribution of local representation. Sometimes we're talking about federal funding and resources to certain communities. And so a lot of what the Biden administration has been talking about is really picking up the conversation that many advocates within certain communities have had about making sure that that the data reflects as many communities as possible in order to help figure out what the needs are of a community.
Well, during the Trump administration, we saw kind of a pause on all of this. It started, well, it's been going on for quite some time, but I think there was an additional efforts to address these issues during the Obama administration, and then a significant hiatus during the Trump administration. And we actually saw some rolling back, and certainly the interest in asking questions, perhaps for other purposes rather than the ones that you cite. So, but one argument is that this does just divide us. And so rather than just help us understand who we are as a country and really be able to determine the distribution of resources, um, why do you think that what is the argument really for um, not just the distribution of resources, but why aren't we just counting people?
Well, the US federal government uses data about race and ethnicity in order to enforce civil rights protections. It's also used in order to help figure out the political representation when we're thinking about enforcing the Voting Rights Act and whether the voting rights of and the political power of people of color are being curtailed in any way in the way voting maps are drawn. That all requires data. And so the way that the federal government has approached this is by creating different categories, racial and ethnic categories, in order to figure out and understand who makes up the US population. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that since the very first census, questions about race have been asked. There were categories, racial categories set up from the very first census back in 1790. And the way the census form has asked about race has changed every decade since then. And in some way, you could think of it as part of a reflection in some way of a national conversation about race, which a lot of time is dominated by who is in power, who has power in the country, in the government, gets to set that conversation. And in more recent decades, I think there's been certainly a lot more advocacy by different community groups to be part of that conversation so that this data that not just the federal government relies on, but businesses, researchers, also state and local governments around the country rely on this for planning purposes, that this data reflect the way people see themselves. And so that, again, the country has a snapshot of who makes up the country and what their needs are.
Yeah, and don't overlook pollsters. Use this data too to figure out how our samples look and make them more representative. Tell me specifically, when I look at the 2030 census, what changes am I going to see from, let's say, the 2020 census in terms of categories, in terms of groups? Um, Obviously, smaller groups are now going to be more represented, and I assume the majority white community may be lower as a result. But tell me what some of the changes are that um, I might see going forward.
I think we should be very clear. These are proposals at this point. In fact, these are
Okay.
early set of proposals, and
Okay.
we're
Good.
currently in a public comment period. And so the White House Office of Management and Budget is asking for public feedback by April 12th about these proposals. And these are potential changes not just to the census form, but to the federal standards on
Okay.
race ethnicity data. So these are standards that the Census Bureau has to follow, as well as every other federal agency that
Mhm.
asks about race and ethnicity on their forms. And so this is a sweeping change. Certainly, any change on the census influences a lot of folks, but this is really a change that is beyond the Census Bureau and the 2030 census.
Okay.
The proposed changes, just to summarize it, because they do get very weedy, and so you could look that up yourself if you want to get into the very specific details. But basically, you may potentially see, as part of these proposals, two new checkboxes that didn't appear in 2020. One specifically for Hispanic or Latino, and another for Middle Eastern or North African. And they would appear alongside boxes for other racial ethnic categories, including Asian, Pacific Islander, as well as American Indian, Alaska Native, white, black, and they would all be under a combined question that asks about race or ethnicity. This would be a change from 2020 as well as earlier forms where there were separate questions. Really, first question asking whether a person is of Hispanic or Latino origin, and then the
Mhm.
second question asking, what is your race? Those two
Mhm.
questions would be combined in this proposal. There are also proposals to require more federal agencies as part of that question to ask for more detailed responses beyond those major categories I just listed. For example, maybe asking for details of whether someone is Jamaican, Chinese, German descent. Those would kind of be additional prompts asking for that detailed information. Um, and that really is potentially continuing a trend that you saw continuing something that you saw in 2020, where there were boxes and also a prompt asking, for example, what a person's non-Hispanic white origins are or their Black origins are. So that wouldn't necessarily be something completely new, but certainly it'd be asking more federal agencies to do that if this proposal were to be approved.
To the folks at the census feel that they've gotten to return back to their expertise and some of the politics of what was going on in the last few years has been a little bit put on a back burner, and you now can focus on the work at hand.
I would say you have to talk to them, but certainly I think what we see right now is that these are proposals that are very similar to the recommendations that the Census Bureau made back around after the 2015 report came out. Or excuse me, back at around 2015, there was a major research project undertaken by the Census Bureau to figure out what would be an ideal way to ask about race and ethnicity. And the proposals I just described are very similar to what the Census Bureau had proposed to the White House Office Management and Budget at the time. And as you mentioned earlier, that review process was stalled during former President Donald Trump's administration. And so a lot of that work that Census Bureau researchers did really got put in a drawer in a way.
Mhm.
And there was expectations that that research would have been potentially implemented in time for the 2020 census. That did not happen. And what we're seeing now is an opportunity to see this research potentially come to light and be enacted upon by 2030.
Yeah, it's been a long time since the standards and the language of the standards has been changed. How might this really impact, regular folks, the average people? I mean, I know how it's going to affect me as a pollster, and I think that it will be a very positive change because it has always been difficult to discern particular groups who are very diverse. And that lack of diversity has always been difficult for us to understand how representative our samples are. But if we drill down to folks that don't actually use census data on a daily basis, how is this going to impact them?
Well, there are folks who are asked to fill out forms whenever they're interacting maybe with the federal government agency like the Census Bureau, or maybe they're going to the doctor's office. These standards set by the federal government are very influential. Even though it's just the federal agencies that collect this racial and ethnic data that's required to follow them, they really set a standard that a lot of researchers, a lot of state and local governments also follow in order for them to really be able to interact really with federal data. So we may see, you go to the doctor's office, for example, you're asked about your racial or ethnic identity. A lot of folks have had a really tough time answering those questions if they identify as Latino or Middle Eastern or North African descent, because there is no box to identify that you are a Middle Eastern or North African descent. That currently, under the current standards, that would be categorized by the U.S. federal government as white. And for folks who identify as Latino, because the U.S. federal government considers Latino identity as an ethnicity and not a race, so an ethnicity that could be of any race, there is a question oftentimes, for example, on federal forms, where someone would identify themselves to be of Hispanic or Latino descent, and then be asked a separate question about race. And for some Latinos, it is very hard to pick a box. Um, and so this would potentially address this very difficult experience that a lot of folks have when filling out these forms. And, you mentioned that it is a very long time. It's been a very long time since these standards have been updated. I just think it's worth noting that the last time these standards were updated were in 1997. which is now a quarter of a century ago.
Yeah, we're such a different country than we were then. So we've got to catch up. So, Hansi, we want to thank you very much for joining us. And I'm just wondering, Barb, whether our next survey should be of census workers and how many of them are part of 23andMe and Ancestry.com. I think it would be kind of like a hobby for people who are in this business. Anyway, Hansi, thanks so much for joining us. I think you're now a three-peater on our podcast, and we certainly love to have a census expert to provide clarity on all these vital issues of which are sometimes under the radar, but are very, very important as you identified. So thanks a lot for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Turning to the fun fact, this one is actually a contemporary fun fact. It's not, we didn't go digging deep into the background of the Roper Center and their archives. This is us, the Marist Poll, and we've been in the field just the last couple of weeks. And we have a question that's timely as could be. And the question is, which event in February are you more excited about, the Super Bowl or Valentine's Day? Is your love of sports growing? Anyway, so the question was that, and the answer was different than Fox News found in, 15 years ago or so. They found Valentine's Day edging out the Super Bowl. Now 45% go for the Super Bowl, 38% go for Valentine's Day, and a full 16% say neither. And I may want to probe that in a little bit because I think we have a naysayer neither amongst us. But I'm clearly a Super Bowl person on this. But let's go around the horn. Ms. Carvalho, what do you got on this one?
Yeah, I always look forward to the Super Bowl and the commercials. It's actually hard sometimes to decide whether I get up and get something to eat or take a break during the commercials or during the game. It's always a tough decision there. But yeah, I'm excited about the Super Bowl. It's lots of food. It's lots of fun. I'm looking forward to watching Mahomes and even the Philadelphia Eagles, although as a Giants fan, it's really, 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 really hard to vote to support them.
Yeah.
But I may stick with our division because
Yeah,
it does prove.
That Empire State color scheme thing is really not playing well to Giant Jet fans in the New York area. Mary
Yes,
Griffith, what do you got on,
the Empire State Building was trying to be supportive of our other new Northeast partner here, and
so not going to happen.
and they lit up. They lit up in green for the Eagles when they won the championships.
So not going to happen if the tables were reversed. Mary Griffith, what do you got on this? Super Bowl, Valentine's Day. I think you're going both seats on this. I think I know why. Nope.
I am not. Super Bowl is the touchdown for me. Hands down, I'm a Super Bowl fan. I think what you're referring to, Lee, is that I met my husband at a Super Bowl party 14 years ago. So that just shows that I look forward to the Super Bowl every year. Valentine's Day
but it can spawn Valentine's Day of the futures, apparently.
It can, but to me, Valentine's Day beyond the chocolate is really, if you need a day, just one day to show somebody you love them, then something's just not right. But for me, Super Bowl is about the food. It's about family. It's about having a good time. And this segment reminds me that I need to put in my Super Bowl food package order sooner rather than later. So why don't we bring in Athen, our producer, a line producer? Athen, Super Bowl or Valentine's Day?
I think I'd say both. Super Bowl personally, I usually just watch it for the halftime show and the commercials. But Valentine's Day, I like when everything's heart-shaped, and I like that the candy is half off the next day. So personally, I would say both.
Have you
Love
stopped
it.
buying Christmas decorations at this point now that they're 90% discounted?
Okay, Jay. So we're
Jay,
outing you. We're outing you, Jay.
All
You're
right, so Athens of both.
you're
I'm
bah
a neither.
humbug.
Yeah, Athens
Yeah.
of both. I'm a neither. I haven't watched a Super Bowl in 20 or 30 years. I couldn't care less. I don't care about commercials. In fact, I kind of hate advertising, so I don't want to watch that. And the halftime show I watch on YouTube. And nowadays it would be more like on Twitter or like TikTok. Valentine's Day, much to my husband's regret, I just am not particularly romantic on a day that seems designed by the Hallmark company to get us to be romantic. So yeah, I'm a neither. I am a definite bah humbug neither.
So I think we've got Super Bowlers, we've got bothers, we've got neithers. I don't think we got a Valentine's Day and no Super Bowl at all. So that one's missing and there's a lot of people in the country, 38%, who think that. And I do think it's interesting. The numbers for the Super Bowl have been growing over time, because I think they've introduced over the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years, the idea of the commercials, maybe even longer, but the halftime show. And, if you don't like the game and the matchup, you've got the other parts to look forward to. But yeah, so good luck to I'm going Kansas City because of the Giant Eagle rivalry. It's hard for me to root for an AFC team, but that's where I am. I'm not convinced they're going to win, but I'll say it's Kansas City, and a box of chocolate somewhere going to be showing up around here too.
I'm just an NFC loyalist, so
Nice.
go Eagles.
Ooh,
Mahomes, people, come on, got to go for Kansas City.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis and Will Promizel.
If you enjoyed Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
If you have questions for us, tweet them directly to @MaristPoll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it will cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub,
There is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.